previous lesson took up the issues of the first encounters between Europeans and Native Americans and the Spanish and Portuguese encounter as they created their New World empires. This lesson is going to take up how Britain, France, and Native Americans all related to each other as Britain and France were trying to create their New World empires. Stepping back a bit though, the English assault on Ireland, which began in the 12th century and spawned bitter struggles and battles for several hundred years, all of which sowed the seeds of suspicion and hatred that fostered racist views of the Irish on the part of the English. It was also in Ireland that the English began to develop the plantation system for control and exploitation of Irish land. Initially, when the early British settlements were sparsely populated, as in the case of Jamestown, and largely all male, despite a few early clashes, the Native Americans were willing to cooperate with the strangers and often sought to incorporate them in their local system of alliances and power relations with other competing tribes. The famous marriage of John Rolfe and Pocahontas brought to the English knowledge of tobacco cultivation and hence a cash crop that could sustain the economy of the colony. But it may also have been seen by the Indians as a way to solidify the cooperative relationship with the English. But in 1620, when British women began to arrive, it appeared to the natives that the English intended to stay permanently and to build their own society. Reacting to the increasing invasion of the English threatening their lands and society, the Powhatan Indians perpetrated the shocking Jamestown Massacre of 1622, which claimed the lives of approximately 347 colonists and came perilously close to extinguishing England's most promising outpost in North America. It also may have permanently prejudiced the English to be more commonly hostile and suspicious of Indians than to be friendly and receptive. Meanwhile, further north of Virginia, in an area that becomes known as New England, British religious settlers, both Puritans and the Pilgrims, initially had reasonable relations with the Native Americans. We have the famous story of the Native Americans participating in and contributing significantly to what's called the First Thanksgiving between the Pilgrims and the Native Americans. However, eventually the relations between the British settlers and the Native Americans erupted into the Pequot War of 1636, and again another major war called King Philip's War in 1675. The Pequot War all but exterminated the Pequot. The English colonists divided surviving captives, assigning them to their allies, the Mohegan and Narragansett tribes. In 1651, John Winthrop the Younger persuaded the Connecticut colony to create a 500-acre reservation for the Pequot in Nonque, removing them from their previous place of residences. In 1666, the Connecticut General Assembly voted to create a 2,000-acre reservation for the Western Pequot, the group previously in the custody of the Mohegans, in Layard, Connecticut. The Eastern Pequot were given 280 acres in present-day North Stonington, Connecticut. Other colonies followed suit in the case of the Brotherton Indian Reservation, established in southern New Jersey in August 1758. So the English decided to establish a policy that the best way to get along with the Indians was to be separate from the Indians and or to separate the Indians from their presence. Hence, the creation of the first reservations in American history and, of course, the beginning of systematic racism. Meanwhile, further north, French fishermen, settlers, fur traders, missionaries, and colonial agents were among the earliest Europeans to have sustained contact with indigenous peoples in what is now Canada and North America. The relationship between the French and the indigenous peoples of the eastern woodlands in the early colonial period was complex and interdependent. France saw indigenous nations as allies and relied on them for survival and fur trade wealth. Indigenous people traded for European goods, established military alliances and hostilities, intermarried, sometimes converted to Christianity, and participated politically in the governance of New France. Eventually, the imperial rivalries between France and England globally and their contest for mastery of North America resulted in what we Americans call the French and Indian War, which lasted from 1754 to 1763. The British colonists were supported at various times by the Iroquois, Catawba, and Cherokee tribes, and the French colonists were supported by the Wabanaki Confederacy and their members, the Abenaki, the Micaya, the Algonquin, the Lenape, the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, Shawnee, and the Wyandot tribes. With France's defeat in the French and Indian War and its removal from Canada, the relations between the Native Americans fell largely to the British and what we might call the Proto-Americans, the British colonists who eventually, by 1776, began to have a sense of themselves and decided to separate themselves from England. During the American Revolutionary War, there was an example of how Americans might treat Native Americans in the Gnadenhutten Massacre, also known as the Moravian Massacre, which was the killing of 96 Christian Delaware by U.S. militiamen from Pennsylvania in 1782 at the Moravian missionary village of Gnadenhutten, Ohio, during the American Revolutionary War. Subsequently, after independence, a number of other battles, conflicts, and little wars ensued between now the Americans and the Native Americans. These were largely in the territory known as the Northwest, which was Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, etc. But it also involved Native Americans in the South and Southeast. Eventually, though, the process of displacing the Native Americans was considered to be the most effective way of dealing with the problems of the fact that though peace treaties might be signed with Native Americans, they did not seem to resolve conflict, either from Native American defense of their territory or American impingement upon their lands. Hence, the presence of Indians in the fertile lands of the Southeast, primed for cotton cultivation, prompted their forced displacement. The Trail of Tears was a series of forced relocations of approximately 60,000 Native Americans in the United States between 1830 and 1850. Several thousand Indians died on the various forced marches, hence the Trail of Tears, and in December 2009, President Barack Obama signed a bill that included an official apology to all American Indians for past injustices. Over the next 60 years or so, a number of wars and battles and conflicts continued to take place between Native Americans and white Americans as the white Americans continued to push westward and impose themselves upon Native American lands. The last battle between the U.S. and military and Native Americans was at Wounded Knee Creek, South Dakota, fought on December 29, 1890. Subsequent to that, Native Americans have been gathered together and placed on a number of reservations all across the United States and expected that that would be the one place where they could live as Indians. Were they not on the Native American reservations, they were expected to act more and more like ordinary Americans. So, institutional racism, as we now call it, began very, very early in the history between white and Native American populations and began to set trends and tendencies towards other groups, which we'll talk about in the next lesson. Please be kind, generous, thoughtful, and reflective. Please use your hearts and minds for good and useful purposes, and please stay healthy.